quickly introduce my colleague, David Kaut, who will then introduce and chat with Commissioner O'Reilly. So David, everyone here I'm sure knows David. He is, in my opinion, without peer when it comes to reporting on tech media telecom issues, particularly those in front of the FCC. He's thorough, he's relentless, he's courageous, and I'm thrilled to have him as a colleague. He also has a background in both reporting and financial analysis. He previously was a reporter at ComDaily, and before that, an associate analyst at Stifel Nicholas and Legg Mason. And please give a warm welcome to David and Commissioner O'Reilly.
Yeah, I don't want to spend a lot of time giving an overview of C-band because I think almost everyone here is pretty familiar with it. But basically, we're talking about repurposing satellite downlink that programmers use to beam their signals after being uplinked to satellites. Then they're beamed down through these frequencies from 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz, and they're beamed throughout the country to broadcasters, cable operators, other pay TV providers, and it's kind of a nationwide way of distributing the program. There's an effort at the FCC to repurpose at least some of this spectrum for terrestrial mobile purposes, and that's engendered quite a little kerfuffle over at the FCC. They came out with a notice of proposed rulemaking about a year and 3 months ago in, I believe, July, looking at various possibilities, and one of the key proposals from C-band Alliance of satellite providers. There's an alternate proposal from ACA Coalition, and T-Mobile and others have proposals. So anyway, we are truly honored to have Commissioner Mike O'Reilly, who is one of 3 Republican commissioners at the Federal Communications Commission. He was sworn in on November 4th, 2013. He brought a wealth of congressional experience with him, having served in numerous important Hill staff positions, including as policy advisor in the office of then Senate Republican Majority Whip, and maybe minority for part of that time. I'm actually as minority. Anyway, the Senate Republican Whip, Senator John Cornyn, and you also had other positions, including on the House side with the Energy and Commerce Committee under then Representative Thomas Bliley, who was first ranking member, I believe, when you were there, and then became chairman.
Sort of. Right.
Sort of. Okay. Well, you can correct. So anyway, we're really honored to have you, and we really appreciate you coming here. So I don't want to bog down in details right at the top. I just want to get, what are your priorities, for the FCC's effort to repurpose some C-band satellite spectrum for wireless terrestrial use?
Sure.
Take it away.
Well, first, David, thank you so much for having me. It's good to see so much interest. When I started debating these issues, it was pretty much by myself. To see a full crowd of interested parties. In fact, I think there's commonality that David kind of alluded to, that this band in some portion or fashion is going to be repurposed. And that's a good thing. We've all come to that agreement. Now it's some of the details. What is it going to look like? How are the specifics going to work out? But to answer your question, what my goal was originally and still is today is to provide new spectrum, mid-band spectrum, for wireless providers to be able to compete both domestically and internationally to offer new wireless services. And my priority in doing that is to expedite that process. I worked really hard on CBRS to get that in a situation, but we know that band is relatively small, and what will be licensed will be capped at 40 megahertz. We know that in a 5G world where licensees are going to seek 100 megahertz blocks, maybe more, a couple in that place. So we're trying to figure out as much as we can. This is the sweetest spot for mid-band spectrum, given its international harmonization. And so my goal is to expedite that process. And so I've talked about it as being speed. That is one of my top priorities.
Okay. You also last week talked about how you weren't bothered by the possibility there could be a private auction, presumably by the C-band Alliance of satellite providers. And do you want to flesh that out a little bit?
Well, look, I have not endorsed that particular proposal. I'm still, there are certain components that I've talked about that would be necessary for me to be supportive. We're still having disagreements over the amount of spectrum and things to that nature. But in general, I'm not bothered by the idea of having a private auction. I am concerned about the timing it would take for the FCC to run an auction. People say, well, the commission does this all the time. It does do in multiple auctions. It takes quite a while. If you look at the the CBRS situation, we made decisions last year. This year, we make the decision to set the date for the auction to run next year at June 25th. And if we're lucky, first licenses are probably by the end of the year when the auction's completed, the long forms are approved, and we get to that point. It's probably the end of the year before anyone gets their license. I can't tell you the exact date, but we're talking a good time frame. And this isn't something that we're just, we have an empty calendar. We have a number of things going on. Just CBRS is going to happen. There are a number of things that are in the pipeline already. 37, 39, 47 at the end of this year. We don't have no idea how long it's going to take with the holidays going on. The chairman's talked about 2.5 gigahertz auction going on. And then on top of that, you've got the RDOF, trying to figure out how can we
You might want to say what that is.
That is our reforming of universal service dollars for a bulk of territory in the United States, and we're trying to make sure those dollars are used in the most efficient manner and trying to connect those areas that don't have service today with broadband. So those are really heady things that are already in the pipeline that are probably not, in my opinion, going to be displaced by whatever we decide here. So I am optimistic that we can figure out a path forward to expedite the process.
Okay. Obviously, Chairman Pai, it's well known he's targeting action for this fall. Today's a very nice fall day, but doesn't seem to be happening quite yet. And a couple weeks ago, you said the FCC was finalizing the details of this spectrum allocation for the C-band, though you acknowledge there could be some squabbling over the specifics. You want to give us any further update on how things are developing over at the FCC?
Well, look, I leave the timing to the chairman. I have to. That's his role. In terms of the details, I think you're going to get to them with all the good people in this room are going to fight over some of the details in the next 40, 50 minutes. They're all known. I've been calling them the 7 or 8 fires that have been percolating for a while, but they're all solvable. Every single component that I've looked at is all solvable. It's really trying to get some of the parties away from, they're dug in on their particular approach when we can find commonality for the betterment of American people.
Okay. So you're deferring to Chairman Pai on timing. He said this fall. You have any sense? Can you give us any sense whether November or December is looking more likely? And do you assume it'll be at one of the meetings?
The second part of your question, I have to leave to the chairman what he wants to do on it. The time, November, December, tomato. I'm not as, like I said, I'm concerned about speed. But a month here or there does not cause me that much concern. If it had to bleed into January, the world would not end. It's really when you're talking about 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 36 months, those things are the problem, in my opinion. A month here or there to make sure it's perfect is probably not that troubling.
Okay. And to be clear, we got about a half hour total here. I will ask a few more questions, and then we'll open it up for audience questions, and then I'll hold some other questions in reserve if we need them, but I suspect we may not. So can you mentioned there's 7 or 8 areas. Can you just tick those off, what you perceive to be the 7 or 8 biggest, or as many as you want to, as you believe the remaining controversies?
Sure. I don't want to say controversies. I think they're all just aspects of things that you expect from a public policy decision maker, and that's what the commission is supposed to do. I know you mentioned that Congress is engaged on this issue, and that to me causes me no heartburn. If in any capacity Congress wants to answer this, enact a statute to decide these things, I will completely respect it, whether I personally agree or disagree. It's irrelevant for my purpose. If Congress passes a statute, the president signs it, that governs the situation. Do I think that's likely? Maybe not, right, at the current moment, given the environment. But that's not for me to say. But in the meantime, I think it's important to go forward. And the issues that we all know, 7 or 8, it's how much spectrum, how fast. There's the fiber issue. There's the fixed wireless and what's remaining. How do we make sure the broadcasters are fully taken care of? There's a host of different issues, that go into that component. No one really talks about the upper guard band, what we're going to need for the altimeters at the top, the FAA situation. No one has really talked about that, but that's something that's really gathered my attention, and is trying to figure that out. When people say, oh, we can take all 500, I say, what are you going to do with the altimeters? They say, what are you talking about? Oh, what altimeters? I'm like, that's a problem.
You mentioned the amount of spectrum. It's no secret that you and other commissioners, at least one publicly, have talked about 300 megahertz as being a target, or about 300 megahertz. Can you give us any more color on that issue? for repurposing for 5G terrestrial?
Sure. I think the landing spot is going to be somewhere around 300, and anyone who's not there is probably delusional or confusing them how this is going to get done. And I'm trying to figure out the pieces. You said, what are the issues? One of the issues is how those blocks are going to be divvied up, and whether you auction them off in tranches, you do them all at once. Are they able to be cleared at once? Are they going to be cleared over time? There's a number of different things that would go into that. What does a private auction look like if it's to be decided that what's the structure, things of that nature. But I think it's 300. A little bit here or there. It's probably a little bit over 300. But that's where I think it lands. It's what's going to need to get where I'm going to need to be comfortable. It's why I've been I haven't endorsed anything to date. That is an issue that needs to be resolved, in my opinion, and it's really important.
What do you think the chances are there's going to be a fiber component, or do you welcome that possibility?
Well, I'm still getting my arms around some of it. I think that some of the debate on the fiber component is a little immature. Not I don't mean like in terms of the people advocating for it. Just the debate itself is a little. I've gone through all the parties and said, don't be greedy in this. This is about trying to repackage and reband C-band for the betterment and offering of wireless services to compete globally and be able to put the United States in a good position with mid-band spectrum. It's not an opportunity to do every other thing that you may want in the moment. It's not a time to figure out how can I get what I want. What's my what can I extract out of this process? So I'm open to the conversation on fiber. I think a lot more detail is necessary before I'm a convert.
Yeah, obviously you're deferring to Chairman Pai on
slip of the tongue there.
Yeah, well, they both begin with P. Both Republicans too. But are we at the point where do you expect to wrap everything up in the fall order, or do you think there's going to be a need for another round of notice and comment on something, perhaps auction design or other details?
It depends on. I would say that it wouldn't bother me if some of the pieces were part of a further item, but I don't know that it's auction design that would be delayed. I think that I want to have the auction done as soon as possible. I don't want to sit out there for another 6-9 months in that situation. If it's a piece that there's a number of the fixed wireless providers have said we can reside in whatever spectrum remains for satellite service. If that were something that needed to be in a further item, that's one thing to look about, because no one has answered the question, what's the impact of a fixed service and a satellite service? The broadcasters that I've talked to are certainly concerned about that. And so if that was something where people were interested in, or my colleagues were interested in, and we wanted to explore that further, that might be a path to do so rather than trying to answer that up front. But I think we can answer almost everything that we need to in the coming months to get this operational.
You mentioned the auction design. You're not crazy about that sitting out there for a long time. Do you have any sense as to how that auction design should look? Because there's obviously been a lot of controversy about that. C-Band Alliance had their proposal. It didn't get a lot of support, and it got some very strong opposition from AT&T and others. AT&T's called for having an FCC-like auction. Other parties obviously want a public auction. It's just like an FCC auction. There's a lot of complexity. There's shared spectrum. There's incentive auction. Any sense at all you can give us on how you would frame this auction?
Well, look, I think, and to your point, I was one of the critics of the proposal that was put out there by the C-band or the CBA in terms of the auction design. I didn't think it was the proper course of action. I didn't think it was sellable to anyone who was going to bid, and we heard from a number of people who were interested in the band that they were not in tuned with it. So I think that was problematic. I think at the end of the day, if we were to head towards a private auction, I think that the auction would look very similar to how the FCC structures the auction. It should be done in a lot quicker fashion.
Okay. We titled this conference, "Is a Court Fight Inevitable?" Inevitable is a very strong word. Do you think it's inevitable? And if you don't think it's inevitable, how likely do you expect it, no matter what the FCC does?
Well, look, at almost everything that's worthy and extensive at the commission gets challenged. There are a few things that don't, and so that wouldn't bother me per se. There are very few legal challenges on this space that would cause me that much concern. But there are some things that you can get through. I was able to get CBRS without a lawsuit. I was able to get KidVid without a lawsuit. Could we carry this home? It's possible. We got a lot of work to do. You've got a lot of good panelists here. If we lock the doors, we probably could come to solutions on a lot of things and prevent that. But is it inevitable there's going to be a lawsuit? That's just kind of par for the course, and in the commission, whoever feels aggrieved. So it wouldn't surprise me. I'd hope to believe not.
Okay. You've also talked about auction proceeds in the past. You want to update us on how you view the potential allocation auction proceeds, including for the U.S. Treasury? Obviously, CBA and Eutelsat have said they're willing to make a significant voluntary contribution to the U.S. Treasury in the case there's a private auction. Do you have any broad general sense of what a good significant contribution would be, or just any general framework for how the allocation should be done? And do you need some sort of methodology, or is this thing going to be subject to some sort of challenge on being arbitrary and capricious?
That has been, your last point has been a concern to mine in terms of the precedent. It has not been my issue. I gave a speech on this recently. Sometimes in life, someone's at the right place at the right time, and it works out in their favor. You happen to own the property right next to where they want to put a baseball stadium, and you're going to make some money. And I get that. That doesn't cause me heartburn that someone's going to make money. People make money on a number of different spectrum bands that are sold in the private side, or the commission does an auction. So that doesn't cause me difficulty. That doesn't cause me problem. That there may be, someone may financially benefit, because I think the other side of that equation, what we get as a society, what we're able to do with the spectrum, what we're able to provide to our wireless providers and others that are interested in buying licenses, maybe new entrants, that's really exciting. That's a necessity for the United States, and I'm willing to trade the one for the other. Others aren't. There have been a number of people who have raised concerns on this, and I don't want to speak for them. They're trying to figure out where their landing spot is. I think it's difficult. In my last job, we worked through this on the broadcast incentive auction, and we determined how much people threw a dart and figured out what number they wanted from the broadcast incentive auction to go to X, Y, and Z spending, which we actually spent before we did the auction. When the spending happened long before the auction did, which is kind of typical Washington. But that's just a process that people wanted to do at the time. I'm not as concerned about it. Others may be in D.C.
Yeah. And I'll ask one more question. We'll throw it open for audience questions. So think of your questions. Do you have any thoughts? There have been some proposals for establishing at least some sort of floor for the Treasury amount, and then some sort of cap for the amount that would go to C-band alliance providers and any other incumbents included in some sort of incentive payments. Do you think that framework makes sense?
Well, I think I answered the second part of the previous question. I don't know that I need to have a particular number that goes to the U.S. Treasury. Other people have sought that out, and where they land is, we'll figure that, we'll see how, one of my colleagues has certainly talked about that publicly, so we'll just see where that goes. In terms of a ceiling, we didn't do one in the broadcast incentive auction. I realize private versus public, but broadcasters were fully able to get as much as the market played out, and so I can't imagine that we would have a ceiling to how much there isn't an artificial, limit that should be imposed on what the spectrum may go for. I don't have a difficulty in terms of what the number may be, and I don't know why we wouldn't possibly impose some type of ceiling.
Okay. All right. So, any questions from the audience? Here's Paul. Paul, go ahead. And do identify yourself if you can when you ask your question.
I thought it was interesting when you spoke to the American Spectrum Management Office. It didn't know much about that 300. And the alliance, the CBA is not really, they weren't there yet. They said we're going to do our best. So are you hopeful that will, you said basically someone is delusional if they're talking about anything less than that. So even though the alliance is indicated they're not quite there, they'll do their best. It sounds like you're confident that they will if they want their plan approved.
And was everyone able to hear that question? Yeah.
The question is,
go ahead.
How confident are you that 300 is going to be the right landing spot if the CBA is not quite there yet? Look, my colleagues and I have talked about this being a landing spot that's a necessity to get us to approve the situation. So I don't see why that is going to be a difficult decision for anyone in the discussion. It's kind of a binary situation right now, and I imagine they're going to see that going forward.
Other questions? Yeah, go ahead and use the mic.
Thanks, Jonathan Make at Communications Daily. I guess I'm curious, you mentioned some previous concerns with some of the plans. Any things about any of the pending plans that you like? Any secondary benefits you see to any of the plans, such as fiber with additional connectivity, rural, urban, digital divide, those sorts of things?
Well, look, I've been told that one of the reasons for having some kind of payment, voluntary payment to the Treasury would be for the connectivity, and now I hear that is another mechanism to get connectivity, and I don't know. I think some of those details are a little, like I said, I think they still need to be fleshed out, and what exactly and how those pieces. People talk about their plan, but I don't know that it all fits together for me right now.
So I don't mean to stick on this 300, Teddy Downey, editor at the Capitol Forum. I don't want to stick on this too much, but the proceeding so far has been really focused on how are we going to make it work at 200 megahertz. So, I mentioned this before, it seems like a good or simple decision to make sure that it's 300 that gets open, but does that not necessarily delay things because of the technical challenges or all the different variables, what's going to happen with the leftover spectrum, all of that necessarily becomes complicated when you start thinking about 300 instead of 200.
Well, it can complicate some issues, but it also can resolve others, and make people more comfortable with potentially going to a private auction. It can solve certain things, and I think providing as much spectrum as possible is a necessity here. Do I think it makes it more difficult to get that extra 100 from 200 to 300? Yes, I acknowledge that. Does it mean that it's all going to become clear at the same point? Maybe not, and that's what I talked about early on in terms of different tranches. Maybe you auction it all. It's all auctioned at the same time, and then it maybe clears at different times. We certainly know that the first 100 can be clear in a very short amount of time. The second a little less, and the third probably requires a lot more work. That fourth, people say, oh, I want fourth, I want 5, and I say, how do you get 5 out of this? What are you going to do with the altimeter? And then they're like, oh, okay. And then 4, even most recently, the conversation is not about 4. The max I've seen from some folks, one of the plans that we talked about is 370. So the numbers are changing. I think we're moving and gravitating towards a 300 universe, in my opinion.
Well, thank you, Commissioner. When we're thinking about timing of the order, one of the aspects that many of us look at are the other orders before the Commission that are requiring the attention of staff. One in particular at the top of my mind is the 900 megahertz band. I believe there's a final order being considered by the Commission now. Do you think that that's a fall of 2019 order as well, or does that drift into next year?
Non sequitur, but I get your point. Look, I don't have anything before me. You can check the CERC list. I get the impression something may come at some point. I don't know that to be the case, but I'll act on it with due haste. In terms of slipping or in terms of timing on any items, I have to defer to the chairman. I'm just that's his role, and I've never been good in predicting exactly where things, this meeting, that meeting, circulation not. That's he gets to do that, until someone changes the process.
I just wanted to understand. I guess when we think about the timeline for implementation of the CBA plan, especially if we're talking about another...
Can you speak up just a little bit?
Sure. The timeline for the implementation of the CBA plan, especially if we're talking about another 100 megahertz. I understand that you're optimizing for time, but it seems like kind of what we're talking about is a more expensive and kind of lower quality option. I'm just trying to understand how you consider the timing aspect of, there seems to be a fair amount of uncertainty about how quickly we would get those 300 megahertz and for a relatively high amount of expense.
Right, and I think I've been talking with all interested parties about what would be the timing. I think that CBA is also considering how fast they can do things, go back to their satellite members and see how fast they could make things happen. That timeline has definitely shrunk since it originally was anticipated, and so that's healthy and helpful. But there's trying to get all the stars in alignment. I think I've outlined some broad principles that are needed for my support. I think those are doable, and I think the timeline's important, and getting that spectrum out. Will I live with something that that maybe certain bands come open a little bit staggered? That doesn't cause me as much heartburn. I want to make sure though that they not be sold in different pieces and different times, and so I'm sensitive to that concern by a number of different entities that have raised it. So timeline's important, and we're trying to put all the different pieces together.
Other questions? We got about 6 minutes or so. I got a few more. Teddy, wait. Go ahead and get your thing so they can hear you, Teddy. No, go ahead. You're good.
Yeah,
All right.
This issue of you mentioned you're not concerned about the windfall issue. Is that but in terms of the commission and getting a consensus on that, how difficult is it to get three Republicans to get to your point where it's like it's not that big of an issue, and is that fully resolved by or a majority of commissioners, I should say, is that fully addressed by this payment to the Treasury?
So I don't know that everyone's going to be in agreement on that at the end of the day. I don't know that I'm going to convince them that I'm right on that, and I don't know that at the end of the day that they won't want something, and so maybe the voluntary contribution that's been talked about in public could satisfy their needs. I don't know the answer. I get the impression some of them have made very clear they want some kind of contribution. I think that's why part of the discussion, both on the Hill and at the Commission, people have talked about some kind of contribution. But so it's possible that may be part of the component. Like I said, it's not my particular issue. It doesn't mean it's not part of one of the 7 or 8 different issues that we're trying to resolve.
Further audience questions? Got about 4 minutes still, actually. 3 minutes.
I feel pretty comfortable. I answered everything, so no need for the panel, right?
All right, Jonathan, another crack.
Thanks. Jonathan at Communications Daily again. Just regarding your remarks about if there is any legislation, although unlikely anything would pass. Do you have any particular view?
I don't think I said unlikely. I said I could see it being difficult in the current
being
environment.
difficult to pass. Okay.
And he used the word maybe too. Anyway.
Do you have any view on what I think Senator Kennedy is trying to do regarding? I think that would mandate there be a public auction, so therefore the FCC run it. I mean, is that something you would welcome, or would you hope the FCC wouldn't have that constriction?
Well, look, I have deepest regard for the chairman of the Appropriations Subcommittee. I think his language is a little bit broader and maybe a little bit more softer than you just portrayed. But if that's the outcome that Congress comes to, then that's what I'll have to live with. I think it could delay a number of things, but they're my boss. I don't tell them what to do, and I'll respect, if that is the end of the discussion. But I don't know that it's going to be that, and that's what I'm trying to move forward, notwithstanding, and trying to get this process moving. I've been working on it for 3+ years, and I can finally see the end of the light, see the end of the tunnel, and see the light, and say, okay, now we can finally get to the point where we can make decisions on a number of different issues if they're outstanding, and get to home for the benefit of the American public and the wireless users for generations to come, because there aren't other great mid-bands available. This is, people say, I told you about CBRS. I've made multiple debates and raised it as loud as I possibly can, including in the last couple of weeks on 3.1 to 3.55 or 3.45 to 3.55, that 100 megahertz. I talked about 7 gigahertz. I've talked about all these different bands that are potentially available, and they're all more challenging, 10 times more difficult, maybe 100 times more difficult than this band. This is all about something we can do and can resolve if we all work, we'll work together, and if there's still outliers, then such is life.
Okay, we got one more question from the audience. Real quick, Jake. Go ahead, Jake. Real quick.
I'd just like to understand kind of, from a high level, I haven't followed your comments super closely, but just,
You should.
well, I mean, probably missed some. I followed them very closely. Just the biggest kind of issues you see with the ACA plan, 'cause it seems like it gets more spectrum freed up, but I'd love to kind of hear your push that.
Well, look, I think there are a number of concerns on the very technical side of the equation. I think people, it also is not lost on me that the satellite industry is not supportive of the proposal. I think there's also concerns from the broadcasting community. I think there are, issues that have been raised, and so I haven't critiqued it and I haven't criticized it. I've said that I think earlier just now I've said some of the debate is a little, not as mature as it needs to be. So I'm not foreclosing the possibility, but I think there are a lot of problems going forward. And what I told all the interested parties early on, and I went group by group and said, since I was one of the early leaders on this conversation, was don't be greedy. And I'm just trying to figure out how does this match in with that conversation. Try and be made whole. This is not to try and solve all your problems. And I was in the elevator coming to this event, and the group started to express why they were there, and I said, look, some of these things are deep bank shots, and you might be making one of those bank shots in a night if you're playing pool, but you're not making them every single time, and so I really want to free up the spectrum for the purposes I talked about as a primary goal and primary purpose. And if we can do some other things, that's great. If they are aligned and they fit through some of the things and people are supportive, then that's one thing. But to go through 7 different machinations to get there and the struggle to do that, and then have potential delay for the process, that's problematic. So I'm trying to work through that.
All right, it's 1 o'clock, and I'm going to give you a final question here. You keep mentioning don't be greedy, so who's being greedy?
No,
I figured that could take a long time or it could be really quick.
No, it was a preemptive call, so I don't argue that anyone is now. I went and said, don't be greedy. If you're a contractee today and you have service, I want to protect your service and have said as much. I want you to have the same service in a repacked band so you're not disrupted. I know the value of the programming that you're getting, and I want that to happen. But it's not an opportunity to put your hand out and say, I want to be paid off here. And so I went to every group and said that. So I was being preemptive in that. I don't know that anyone's being greedy. I leave that as someone else's determination. At this point, I'm trying to, resolve issues. I've already set up that conversation months ago, and now it's trying to make some final decisions with the chairman, and we get to home on this.
Okay, we're a little past 1. I think we're gonna call it.
Many thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. Appreciate it.